I'm a huge fan of Mary Coral, so I think that, spending 20 minutes just telling you about what we're going to do next reminds me of many of my family functions. We'd spend great effort to get together, and as soon as we get together, we talk about when we're going to get together next. So this is a wonderful, wonderful thing. This is going to be a fabulous program that we're doing at UCLA. It's going to be an afternoon symposia on the cabaret-esque in Jewish music by leading scholars. Phil Bowman, a scholar at the University of Chicago, who's done a lot of research on Jews and the cabaret, along with some other faculty, Tamar Levitz at UCLA Musicology, Paul Lerner at USC, and Stefan Pennington at Tufts to talk about the intersection between Jewish life in Germany, in Europe, and America, and the cabaret. Really fascinating topic that I'm putting together. And then this group called the New Budapest or FAM Society, who've already put out 3 CDs, and their last CD called When Dreams Fall Apart was just nominated for a Grammy. And they will be performing at UCLA in the Schoenberg Hall at 8 p.m. The events are free. All you have to do is get to UCLA to make this work. And I hope you can all come because these programs cost a lot of geld. Yeah. There's very, very expensive programs to do, and it's very important that I hope that they'll be successful. I know that the people who are involved are really terrific, and if you could come, it would really, really be great to show support for it. Okay, so today, without further ado, I'm going to talk about Yiddish theater. And Yiddish theater, of course, is a fascinating topic to discuss. One of the most challenging things about talking about Yiddish theater is that the materials that we have, though, are actually quite limited. It really would be great to really show readily have. Most of the Yiddish theater productions were done sort of without music or just a lead sheet. It wasn't until later that they would be orchestrated or there would be ways to reconstruct them, but many of them were done in a very, very simple fashion. But yet there is a lot of material to talk about in terms of looking at it, but we have to do some sort of comparative work to really understand it. So as a basic way of understanding, oh, thank you, okay. Usually my son does that, but he's in the back on his iPad, but I don't want to embarrass him, so I won't. So, all right, so if we look at opera, which of course is a very important art form, whenever I talk about opera to today's college students, I always say, if you think of the most important art form today, what would you say? And most people say movies, right? Because movies, I was one of them going to the premiere of Star Wars because I'm a huge Star Wars fan. But the fact that movies have such an impact on culture in the United States and worldwide is so significant. That's the impact that opera had in culture in the 17th century, the 18th century, and the 19th century. So the music was very formal in opera. There was no dialogue. Music was developed through what was called a recitative and an aria. And operetta, which developed in the 19th century, sometimes had formal music, but there began to be more dialogue, and the narrative wasn't always propelled by the music. Sometimes the narrative was propelled by the spoken word. But the drama, the most dramatic scenes, did really happen through music. A musical is different in that regard, and that the music is in a more popular idiom. There's more dialogue in it, and most of the music just punctuates the drama. The drama has already happened, and the music is just sort of punctuating the things that are happening. Now, we could discuss these definitions. In some ways they work, in some ways they don't work, but as a basic understanding, when we want to put Yiddish theater into this mix, it's somewhere in sort of this region over here. It's usually, or it starts and begins in very popular forms of music. There are ways in which we'll talk about that people try and formalize it a little bit more. But usually the drama is happening through dialogue as well as song. And this is something that really happens in so many other cultures where there's satirical forms of opera and musical performance. There's opera buffa, there's opera comique, different forms of opera that really develop in various cultural arenas. A lot more to really say about that, but in the Jewish culture, what's significant to know is that while we look at Yiddish theater as really developing in the late 19th century, with Abraham Goldfaden, it really comes out of a tradition in Jewish culture of Purim spielen, right? The Purim plays, that are done in a context of telling the Purim story, that people develop those stories in ways that speak about their own contemporary culture and sort of have a mix of reality of sort of a mythic past and how they put the present within that particular perspective. And also something else called the Badchin, right? The Badchin in the Jewish wedding, the court jester who's really telling stories. And these are all sort of also very much part of the origins, oh, thank you, of Yiddish theater. That is the era that we also call the golden age of the American cantorate. It's the time period where 2 million Jews are coming from Eastern Europe to the United States. And what makes the golden age of the cantorate so iconic is that the music is recorded on, of course, 78s. And the fact that the music is recorded, we know what cantor Yosel it is. We don't have to guess at what they sound like. We know what they sounded like. We had another time, I'd be happy to tell you a lot more about the golden age of the cantorate. There actually are videos of some of these cantors singing as well, which are really fascinating, but very, very, very limited videos of them. But we call this same era, relatedly, the golden age of Yiddish theater. And we sort of look at the golden age. You always find the golden age when you're out of the golden age, right? You are sort of looking back really towards the past. But this is the time period when these particular arenas of music and Jewish culture are really developing. So what I want to do is sort of give you sort of a basic framework of looking at different eras of Yiddish theater. And the first half of my talk will be going through different eras of Yiddish theater, giving you different examples of it. And then the second half will be looking at how Yiddish theater has had an impact on American popular culture. So we'll begin by talking about Abraham Goldfaden and the folk music that began Yiddish theater in 1878, and then move into the early 1900s. So it's as you say in Hebrew, I don't know how you say this in Yiddish, but Be'erech 1910, around 1910, not a fixed. Say Be'erech in Yiddish? Okay. Oh yeah, so, paraliturgical. I didn't know how to say that in Yiddish. Erech 1910, around this time period, things really begin to change in Yiddish theater as it comes into America and has very much of a vaudeville style, which we'll look at. And finally, by the late 1920s into the 1920s, it really develops into a more matured art form. And then eventually, Yiddish theater, in a sense, gets eclipsed by Yiddish cinema. And Yiddish theater really does begin to wane. It's like most things with looking at klezmer music too. Although it wanes, you still find forms of course, in Yiddish theater, there are still productions of Yiddish theater. The Folksbiene, which operates in New York, doesn't operate like it used to, but still a functioning entity in a very interesting way. So I want to begin with, in terms of talking about Yiddish theater, is looking at Abraham Goldfaden, who was raised in a very religious Jewish community, was a very learned Jew. He then worked as a journalist and was traveling around, and really through this like period of enlightenment in the 19th century was really encountering many, many different stories, finding out about Shakespeare, really learning about Western culture, and wanting to take these ideas and express them into the Jewish community. I'm sure many of you know the stories of Abraham Goldfaden because everyone talks about them when you talk about Yiddish theater. So Yiddish theater begins in 1876. This is at least one picture of Bar Kochba. He often takes biblical stories or biblical subjects and makes them the topic of his various programs. And this is from sheet music published in 1883. Let's go to the next couple other images to show you. One is this very, very interesting one, a poster in Romania of Bar Kochba, and you can see that it's sort of a mix of different languages, but it's announcing the celebrated author Goldfaden's Bar Kochba, as you see there. Let's go to the next one. We'll get to some music in just a second. So Shalamis is sort of one of his first really well-known hits, and there's a very important song that comes out of this. Let's go to the next one called Picture off the YIVO website. And this comes from 1938, of a picture of a production of the Warsaw Yiddish Art Theater of Shalamis. And you can sort of see this sort of stylization of a harp, which is associated with King David. And the story of Shalamis is that someone sort of traveling on the way to the temple and sort of encounters this woman Shalamis in a well. And the story of Shalamis is a very interesting story because it's not a biblical story, it's sort of a midrashic story. It has sort of different sort of tellings of it. But this is sort of hearkening back to the times of the temple. So let's go to the next one. And this is, of course, one of the most well-known Yiddish theater songs, or if we would say what were the top 5 Yiddish theater songs, this is certainly would be one of them, Rosh and Kiss mit Mandlin. And what's interesting to note about it is that we know that Goldfun, as far as we know, wrote the words to this. The melody of it is a little bit of a controversy amongst music scholars. We don't know if Goldfun actually wrote this melody or this melody was adapted from some other folk songs or folk sounds. But what's so fascinating as we hear this is that it's going to sound in the very beginning very much like cantorial music. It's going to sound very familiar in the Eastern European musical world. So the first recording I'll play is a 1920s recording. As I usually do in these sort of presentations, everyone loves to sing along. Feel free to do that. But I also want you just to listen to this recording because it's not going to be one you've probably heard before. So let's go ahead.